Chicago, 1893. The city rose in a blaze of electric light for the World's Columbian Exposition, a spectacle meant to proclaim America's triumph of industry and progress. But only blocks away from the fair's white palaces stood another structure outwardly unremarkable, yet destined to earn a name whispered in dread, the castle. Its builder, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, was a man of polished charm and polite manners, a pharmacist and entrepreneur whose eyes never betrayed the depths of calculation behind them. To investors, he was a visionary; to young women seeking employment or lodging, a benefactor; to unsuspecting guests, a courteous host. Yet within the walls of his labyrinthine hotel lay concealed corridors, false doors that led nowhere, rooms without windows, staircases that ended in dead walls, and chambers designed for a single purpose: entrapment. Gas pipes snaked invisibly behind plaster, allowing Holmes to suffocate occupants at will. Chutes dropped silently into the basement, where furnaces roared hot enough to erase every trace of flesh. It was said that Holmes could stroll the fairgrounds by day, a picture of refinement, while at night screams were swallowed by the castle's soundproof rooms. In a city celebrating progress and modernity, one man built a shrine to death itself, and as the crowd swelled to marvel at the wonders of the fair, they unknowingly walked into the hunting ground of America's first serial killer. Before we descend deeper into the twisted corridors of Holmes's castle, take a moment to steady yourself. If history written in blood unsettles you, share this story with someone who thinks the past holds no danger. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your state, and make sure you're subscribed. The doors to this tale are closing behind us, and once we step inside, there will be no turning back. Chicago, in the final decade of the 19th century, was a city born from fire and built upon ambition. Only 2 decades earlier, the Great Fire of 1871 had reduced much of it to ash and rubble, but the catastrophe had also cleared the ground for reinvention. By the early 1890s, the skyline was jagged with steel and brick, boasting some of the world's first skyscrapers. Railroads converged like veins into the heart of the city, bringing cattle to the stockyards, timber from the north, and thousands of men and women in search of work. The noise of trains, the stink of slaughterhouses, the constant hum of factories and printing presses. Chicago was not only rebuilt, it was alive with ceaseless energy. The year 1893 marked a pinnacle in this transformation. The World's Columbian Exposition, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, drew millions from across the country and the globe. On the shores of Lake Michigan rose the White City, its gleaming neoclassical facades illuminated by the new marvel of electric light. Visitors arrived by the thousands each day, their eyes wide with wonder at exhibits of machinery, cultural pavilions, and the massive Ferris wheel that spun against the skyline. The fair was a dream made real, a display of progress and prosperity, a promise that the modern age would be grander and safer than any that had come before. Yet not far south of the fairgrounds, in the neighborhood of Englewood, stood streets that looked far different from the polished boulevards of the Exposition. Here the air was heavy with smoke and coal dust, and boarding houses leaned tiredly against one another. Shopkeepers called from narrow storefronts, peddling everything from cut-rate clothing to patent medicines. It was a place of opportunity for the desperate, a district where immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Scandinavia, and Italy mingled with rural migrants from the American Midwest. Among the clatter of horse-drawn wagons and the cries of newsboys selling papers, a new building began to rise on the corner of 63rd and Wallace. The structure was peculiar from the beginning. It grew in uneven phases, walls torn down and rebuilt, staircases shifted, contractors dismissed before the job was finished. Blueprints changed constantly, and no single architect ever completed the design. Those who worked on it spoke later of its confusing layout, of orders that made no sense, of rooms sealed behind new plaster and doors that opened to brick. From the street, it appeared ordinary enough, a solid 3-story brick building with retail shops on the ground floor and lodging rooms above. But inside, behind the polished counters and tidy shelves of a pharmacy, a stranger geometry was taking shape. Corridors stretched farther than seemed necessary. Windows looked out upon walls of brick, and staircases ended abruptly at ceilings. Chicagoans who walked past it on their way to the fair had little reason to suspect what was hidden within. They were focused instead on the promise of employment and profit that the exposition brought. Hotels filled beyond capacity, restaurants ran short of seats, and the influx of strangers created both opportunity and anonymity. In a city of nearly 1.5 million people, it was easy to arrive unnoticed and vanish without trace. The fair drew more than a quarter of the nation's population to Chicago that year. No one could keep count of every guest, every tenant, every traveler who came and went. The city's grandeur provided cover for those who wished to remain unseen. Englewood was not a district of monuments and marvels. It was a district of survival where working families stretched meager wages and drifters searched for a cheap room and a meal. In its crowded streets, men in search of work at the stockyards mingled with women arriving from small towns, hoping for employment in the bustling retail shops. It was here that the building, soon to be called the Castle, stood waiting, its brick façade offering the image of respectability to those who entered its doors. For the World's Fair brought not only spectacle and wonder, but also a tide of vulnerable souls. Young women arriving alone in search of opportunity, travelers who trusted signs advertising rooms for rent, and workers who believed that progress had created a safer, brighter America. Chicago offered light, invention, and the dream of modernity, but within the shadow of its brightest achievement rose a place designed for secrecy. While the White City promised order and progress, the castle across town promised only what its owner chose to reveal. Behind its walls, hidden from the noise of the fair, architecture itself became an accomplice to human appetite. In a city that celebrated triumph, a darker blueprint was already complete. The building at 63rd and Wallace did not stand empty for long. Its proprietor, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, cultivated an image of refinement and opportunity that drew people into his orbit. Born Herman Webster Mudgett in New Hampshire, he had remade himself in Chicago with the confidence of a man who understood how easily Americans admired Polish. He dressed impeccably, spoke with calm assurance, and introduced himself as a physician and businessman. Those who met him saw a courteous man with striking eyes and a disarming smile. Behind that smile, he was already calculating how the castle could serve a purpose unlike any hotel in the city. The first floor was filled with activity that concealed its deeper design. Holmes opened a pharmacy stocked with patent medicines and remedies, a place where neighbors came for cough syrups, tonics, and powders. The pharmacy quickly earned trust, and soon the shop became a hub where local residents exchanged gossip and young women found clerical work. In adjoining storefronts, Holmes leased space to jewelers, restaurateurs, and small retailers, cultivating the appearance of a thriving commercial corner. Behind the counters and shelves, however, he alone kept the master keys to the upper floors. The second and third stories housed what Holmes advertised as lodging rooms for fair visitors. The World's Columbian Exposition created unprecedented demand for accommodations, and the castle promised convenient, inexpensive quarters only minutes from the fairgrounds. Visitors arrived expecting simple hospitality, and many found themselves impressed by the owner's polite demeanor. Women in particular were drawn to his offers of employment as stenographers, bookkeepers, and clerks. For young, unmarried women traveling to Chicago, Holmes presented himself as a figure of protection, a man of respectability in a city where predatory landlords and unsafe neighborhoods were common. The staff he hired rarely remained long. Bookkeepers who took positions often left without notice, their departures explained away by Holmes as personal matters or sudden opportunities elsewhere. Typists and stenographers arrived eager for work, were seen around the building for a few weeks, and then vanished. Each time, Holmes assured concerned acquaintances that the young women had moved on or returned to their families. In a city swollen with strangers, departures were not questioned too deeply. Letters were rarely traced, and railroads made it easy for someone to disappear. Few suspected that the missing women had never made it to another station. Holmes surrounded himself with accomplices, though few understood the full extent of his schemes. A young attorney named Jephthah Howe managed some of his business affairs, often unaware of the fraudulent nature of the documents he signed. Associates invested in ventures. Holmes created drug patents, mechanical inventions, real estate opportunities, and seldom realized the profits vanished into the castle's construction. Workers hired to finish rooms upstairs found themselves dismissed abruptly before they could see the building's design completed. Gas fixtures were installed in rooms that lacked fireplaces or stoves. Doors were hung with locks that opened only from the outside. Narrow chutes descended directly into the basement, their smooth surfaces designed so nothing thrown into them could return. The basement itself was unlike any other in the neighborhood. Massive furnaces stood ready to consume, their iron mouths opening like the gates of industry. Vats of quicklime and acid barrels were kept out of sight, their presence explained as necessary for cleaning or manufacturing. Workbenches held surgical instruments and skeletal parts, the tools of a man who called himself a doctor. It was said that articulated skeletons were sold to medical schools, that crates left the castle labeled as educational specimens. Few questioned where the bones had originated. Among Holmes's tenants and neighbors, impressions varied. To some, he was a model of industry, expanding Englewood's commerce with his pharmacy and lodgings. To others, he seemed enigmatic, always polite, but never entirely forthcoming about his past. When women disappeared, whispers circulated, but explanations, elopement, new employment, sudden travel were easier to accept than the alternative. Chicago was a city in motion, and missing people were not uncommon. Holmes cultivated relationships with women beyond business. He charmed them with talk of marriage, financial security, and adventure. Engagements overlapped, false promises multiplied, and each new companion seemed unaware of the last. Jewelry from one woman might appear in the possession of another. Letters home were intercepted or never written. To acquaintances, Holmes appeared generous, always providing work or lodging to those in need. To those who vanished, he was the last familiar face they encountered. Doctors, priests, and neighbors passed through the castle without ever grasping its design. The hallways twisted into dead ends. Rooms lacked windows but carried air vents connected to concealed pipes. Floors tilted toward hidden chutes. The design itself was a labyrinth, a trap disguised as lodging. When a tenant vanished, it was easy to assume she had left the city, just another thread lost in the tapestry of the World's Fair. But beneath the surface of the castle, the reality was darker than anyone could imagine. By the summer of 1893, as visitors thronged Chicago's White City, the castle in Englewood filled quietly with strangers. Some arrived for work, others for a cheap bed near the fair. They stepped across its polished threshold, believing they had found safety, unaware that its owner had engineered every corridor, every lock, and every furnace for a singular purpose. The city outside celebrated light and progress, but within those walls, secrecy and silence reigned. The stage was set, the players unknowingly chosen, and the castle itself waited to become the theater of America's most infamous nightmare. The first real cracks in the facade of Holmes's Englewood enterprise began to appear in the months leading up to the peak of the Columbian Exposition. Until then, most of the activity around the castle had been explained away by the steady turnover of employees, the shifting faces of tenants, and the constant swirl of strangers drawn to Chicago by work or spectacle. But the fair magnified every absence, every unexplained disappearance, because families wrote letters that went unanswered, friends waited at train stations in vain, and employers noticed when their new hires never reported for duty. The first incident that stirred real suspicion concerned a young woman named Julia Connor, who lived with her daughter Pearl in rooms above the pharmacy. Julia had once worked in the jewelry shop on the castle's ground floor and had become entangled in Holmes's life in ways both financial and personal. Her presence was familiar to neighbors, her daughter often seen playing on the street or in the shop, her laughter a part of the daily life of Englewood. Then, without warning, both mother and child disappeared. Holmes explained to anyone who asked that Julia had gone west, perhaps to Iowa, to start a new life with relatives. He presented the story with practiced calm, insisting that she had left on her own accord, but those who knew Julia doubted she would abandon her life so abruptly. Letters sent to her family produced no reply. The Connor disappearance lingered uneasily in the neighborhood's memory, but Englewood was a place accustomed to transience. The influx of visitors for the fair meant rooms emptied and filled constantly. It was not unusual for tenants to vanish without notice, leaving unpaid bills and unanswered questions. Holmes's explanation sufficed for the moment, but beneath the surface a pattern had been set. The castle had begun to claim lives more boldly. Another case that would later emerge involved a stenographer named Emmeline Sigrand. She had been hired by Holmes with the promise of respectable work and perhaps even marriage. Letters she wrote to friends before her disappearance spoke with optimism of a future in Chicago, of opportunities that seemed secure and prosperous. Yet she, too, vanished without a trace. When pressed, Holmes suggested she had left, to be married elsewhere, that she had no further need of her position. But the stories conflicted, and those who knew Emmeline doubted that she would disappear voluntarily without contacting loved ones. Behind the walls of the castle, the design of its rooms began to reveal their purpose. Tenants noticed that certain doors locked only from the outside. Guests remarked that windows were strangely absent, that ventilation grills appeared where no stove or fireplace required them. One chamber was later discovered to have been lined with asbestos and fitted with a gas connection that could be controlled remotely from another room. Such details were invisible to outsiders at the time, but they would later become evidence of the building's true function. The basement told its own story, though only Holmes knew it then. Chutes that opened from upper floors ended in a dim, brick-lined cellar. There the massive furnace roared, capable of reducing remains to ash. Acid vats stood ready, their contents strong enough to strip flesh from bone. Surgical instruments lay neatly arranged, not for healing but for dismemberment. Crates labeled as medical supplies and educational specimens were prepared for shipment, bound for universities and hospitals that asked no questions about the origins of their anatomical materials. The castle was not a hotel at all. It was a machine built to erase the presence of its victims. As the fair swelled with millions of visitors, more young women came to Chicago in search of employment. The castle became a lure for them, promising work as typists, secretaries, or clerks. Holmes's practiced charm drew them in. Some were last seen stepping across the threshold, clutching small suitcases. Others were recorded signing the ledger in neat handwriting. Few were ever seen again. For the families who searched, the explanations were vague. Elopement, sudden travel, personal choice. But the silence of their daughters grew louder with each unanswered letter. The neighborhood began to sense unease. Shopkeepers whispered about women who came to the castle and never returned. Clerks noted that Holmes frequently dismissed employees suddenly without explanation. The pharmacist downstairs heard footsteps pacing late at night in rooms that should have been empty. Rumors spread that Holmes's business dealings were dishonest, that his wealth was built on fraud, that he had taken out insurance policies on employees and acquaintances who soon after vanished. The most disturbing discovery came when creditors and business partners began to press him for repayment. Their investigations uncovered false names, multiple marriages, and a trail of debt stretching across several states. While the city celebrated the wonders of the exposition, a darker truth was beginning to surface in Englewood. Holmes was not simply a charming doctor and businessman. He was a man surrounded by vanished women, unexplained deaths, and a building whose very walls seemed designed for concealment. The first incident did not yet spark full investigation, but it planted seeds of suspicion. The disappearances of Julia Connor, her daughter Pearl, and Emmeline Cigrand would later be recognized as part of a pattern. At the time, they were whispers, unexplained silences, uneasy glances exchanged between neighbors who preferred not to imagine the worst. The castle stood quiet and unassuming on 63rd Street, but inside its walls the machinery of Holmes's true enterprise was already at work. The fair outside promised progress and safety, but Englewood had become the stage for a horror that no one was yet ready to name. By the summer of 1893, the world's Columbian Exposition was in full bloom. The White City gleamed on the lakeshore, drawing millions of visitors who marveled at its illuminated avenues and towering exhibits. The fair was a celebration of invention, culture, and progress. But within the Englewood neighborhood, another story was unfolding. The castle, with its brick façade and bustling pharmacy, stood quietly at the intersection of opportunity and dread. As crowds pressed into the fairgrounds each morning, others slipped unnoticed into the castle, seeking work, lodging, or companionship. Too many never emerged. The disappearances began to multiply, and the explanations offered by Holmes grew thinner. Neighbors recalled the sudden absence of Julia Connor and her young daughter Pearl, who had been fixtures in the community. The memory was still fresh when Emmeline Cigrand's cheerful presence vanished as if it had never been. Soon after, reports surfaced of another young woman, Minnie Williams, who had come to Chicago from Texas. Minnie had inherited property in Fort Worth and appeared to have entered into a romantic attachment with Holmes. For weeks, she was seen in his company, sometimes at the pharmacy, other times walking beside him in Englewood. Then her appearances ceased, and when her sister Anna traveled north to visit, she too fell under Holmes's charm. Both sisters disappeared, their names eventually added to the growing list of women last seen at the castle. Inside the building, architecture revealed its sinister logic more clearly with each disappearance. Guests who stayed in its rooms later described narrow chambers with air vents that seemed unnecessary, locks that clicked shut from the outside, and hallways that twisted into dead ends. One former worker remembered delivering linens to a room with a gas fixture but no lamp or stove. Another recalled seeing Holmes test doors repeatedly, locking and unlocking them with an expression of satisfaction, as though ensuring they would hold under strain. The basement remained a place of unease. Workmen delivering coal noticed the oversized furnace and its relentless glow at odd hours of night. Barrels labeled as cleaning agents emitted sharp, acrid odors that clung to clothing long after leaving the cellar. A neighbor passing by the castle late one evening saw smoke thick as pitch, curling from the chimney, carrying with it a smell that was not quite coal, not quite wood, but something heavier. When asked, Holmes dismissed it as a necessary cleaning process for the pharmacy, a technical matter no one else could understand. Few pressed further, but the rumors would not stay buried. Englewood residents whispered about young women who had been hired at the castle and never seen again. A seamstress told friends that she had visited to inquire about work and had been unsettled by Holmes's gaze, leaving before she could be shown to an upstairs office. A delivery boy recalled carrying crates marked glassware into the basement and hearing a faint metallic clatter from within that suggested otherwise. Employees at nearby shops noted that Holmes seemed to change staff with unusual frequency, each new face vanishing after a few weeks. The fair itself contributed to the concealment of these vanishings. Millions of strangers flooded into the city, and many left as suddenly as they came. If someone disappeared, it was easy to assume they had returned home or moved on to another opportunity. Telegraph offices could not keep up with the volume of messages. Letters went astray, unanswered for weeks. Families in distant states waited months before realizing they would never hear from their daughters again. Chicago, vast and bustling, swallowed the missing without pause. Holmes exploited this anonymity with ruthless efficiency. He placed advertisements for employment in local papers, promising respectable work for young women in need of income. He spoke of opportunities as stenographers, secretaries, or bookkeepers, respectable positions that would draw educated women seeking independence. When they arrived, they were welcomed with courtesy, offered rooms in the castle, and soon after were never seen again. The rooms above the pharmacy became the last known addresses of dozens of hopeful visitors. Behind his charm and calculated manners, Holmes was also conducting a quieter business. Skeletons, medical specimens, and preserved organs began to appear on the market, sold to universities and medical schools that asked few questions. Laboratories needed material for study, and Holmes provided it. Articulated skeletons were shipped in crates, labeled with academic destinations. His training in medicine and anatomy gave him the skill to prepare such remains. The castle's basement became not only a place of disposal but of profit, turning tragedy into commerce. In the neighborhood, suspicion deepened but rarely hardened into action. Holmes's reputation as a doctor and businessman shielded him. His pharmacy provided remedies and tonics to local families, and many respected his apparent success. He paid his creditors selectively, keeping some satisfied while deceiving others with promises of repayment. When confronted, he disarmed with polite words, his calm demeanor making doubts seem unfounded. Yet behind closed doors, his schemes were multiplying as rapidly as the disappearances. What unsettled observers most were the patterns. Entire families were said to have arrived at the castle only to vanish. A woman traveling with a trunk of fine clothing was last seen entering with Holmes. Later, her belongings were quietly sold off, and no word of her departure reached her relatives. Another young woman was overheard telling a friend she had been promised marriage by Holmes, only to vanish days later. The friend, when questioned, admitted she had not believed the story until it was too late. The rumors spread beyond Englewood. Articles in small papers hinted at unexplained disappearances, though they were overshadowed by the grandeur of the exposition. Police received occasional complaints, but lacked evidence and were consumed with other matters: pickpockets, frauds, accidents at the fairgrounds. In a city overwhelmed by spectacle and crime alike, Holmes's carefully constructed castle was the perfect veil. By late summer, the castle had become a labyrinth of silences. Its locked rooms, false corridors, and secret chutes functioned as designed, each disappearance feeding into the machinery below. The city outside celebrated invention and light, while within those walls gas fixtures hissed faintly. Furnaces roared and barrels waited in shadow. Suspicion was rising, but it was still dispersed, fragmented into whispers and unanswered letters. No one had yet drawn the pattern fully. No one had yet counted the vanished as a single list. But the castle was already operating at full capacity, and the first hints of horror were settling over Englewood, like smoke too heavy to disperse. The escalations of that summer marked the transformation of rumor into dread. It was no longer one missing woman, nor two. It was a series, each disappearance linked by proximity to the same corner, the same pharmacy, the same smiling proprietor. The castle was becoming what it had been designed to be all along, not a hotel for travelers, but a trap disguised as opportunity, a structure built to consume life, while the rest of the city applauded its own progress. By early autumn, the rumors around Englewood hardened into something heavier than talk. Patterns that had drifted like smoke began to settle as residue. The post office tallied envelopes returned again and again to families in Texas, Indiana, and Iowa, each addressed to women last known to be boarding near 63rd and Wallace. A clerk in a telegraph office noted repeat summons that drew no reply. A dressmaker recorded deposits left by hopeful clerks who never returned to claim finished garments. Ledger lines across disparate businesses began to describe the same negative space. Promises made, items ordered, names that vanished. Facts accumulated in places that did not yet speak to one another. An attorney retained to formalize a deed transfer discovered that property once belonging to a young woman from Fort Worth now listed a trustee with a name that reappeared in other transactions tied to the castle. An insurance adjuster, following the trail of small claims and suspicious fire losses in other states, found signatures that matched, not perfectly, but with the peculiarities of a hand that had taught itself to be many people. A coal supplier's receipts showed deliveries to a basement furnace at hours when other cellars cooled, the tonnage out of proportion to any ordinary hotel's needs. An apothecary wholesaler filled repeat orders for acids and caustics, classified as cleaning supplies, unusual in both quantity and frequency. Inside the castle, structure and function were converging. Former workmen spoke privately of rooms sheathed behind fresh plaster, of vents that connected not to comfort but control, of doors whose hardware admitted only an external key. A carpenter's notebook, kept for the mundane purpose of billing, listed a chute framed from smooth-planed lumber descending toward the basement, and a steel-lined chamber whose seams were sealed with an attention more common to vaults than guest rooms. A locksmith recalled being asked to install peculiar locks, whose turning cams were oriented to defeat anyone inside who might press against them. None of these fragments, taken alone, proved intent. Together they suggested an interior that answered to a plan no house should require. The circle of missing tightened around specific names: Julia and Pearl, absent beyond the span of polite explanation; Emmeline, whose optimism had been recorded in letters that suddenly ceased; Minnie, with inherited property that passed through hands too quickly; Anna, whose arrival produced fresh sightings and then silence. Boarding-house keepers at other addresses reported that trunks appeared bearing monograms of women no longer present to claim them. Pawnbrokers logged jewelry whose feminine provenance did not match the men who offered it. Stones were reset, settings melted, marks erased. Profitable commerce grew in the shadow of disappearance. A medical college accepted articulated skeletons shipped in sturdy crates, labeled as educational materials, the sender presenting credentials sufficient to end inquiry. A catalog house paid cash for osteological preparations and preserved organs with clean labels, the sort of anatomical trade that flourished in a city with teaching hospitals and laboratories. The castle's proprietor possessed the training to supply such goods. The basement possessed the equipment to make origins indistinct. Holmes's public world remained tidy. The pharmacy served cough syrups and patent tonics. The ground floor leases changed hands often enough to suggest healthy demand. He entertained creditors with careful installments and future dates. juggling obligations with a precision that kept any single claim from maturing into a crisis. He cultivated neighbors with courtesies, tipped errand boys, and maintained a tempo of busy respectability that, in Englewood's economy of appearances, converted doubt into reluctance. Yet measurable details pressed outward. Chimney sweeps described soot with an odor they did not associate with coal alone, a fatty sweetness that clung to cloth. A laundry received stained linens marked from the castle with discolorations resistant to ordinary lie. A delivery boy set down a crate in the basement and noticed iron rollers at waist height, leading toward the furnace door, a mechanical convenience unnecessary for ordinary waste. A scrap of charred metal retrieved from ash revealed the outline of corset busks and fasteners that do not burn as completely as cloth. Small, durable things endured where other evidence vanished. The fair's calendar concealed as much as it revealed. Its great wheel turned, its lights burned, and its schedule provided an alibi as wide as a city. The constant movement of visitors explained departures and excused absences. Employers in other wards waited for hires who never arrived, assuming a change of plan. Mothers delayed worry until winter, expecting the lag of distance. Police, consumed by swindles and petty thefts that attend crowds, logged missing person notes without assembling them into a single picture. The scale of celebration dispersed attention. The castle's design concentrated it inwards. Skepticism existed, but it fractured under the weight of uncertainty. Some insisted that the missing had eloped, that young women intoxicated by the fair's promise chose reinvention. Others pressed that the city's vice districts swallowed the unwary. Newspapers printed small notices that bled from one column to the next, between advertisements for spectacles and miraculous cures. A pastor in a nearby parish kept a private list of parishioners' daughters who had not written home. His marginalia recorded a preponderance of last addresses near Englewood, but stopped short of a public accusation that might ruin reputations if wrong. Financial pressures tightened the frame. Lawsuits nipped at the castle's owner. From multiple directions, mechanics' liens, unpaid invoices, contested notes, each small enough to negotiate, all together forming a mesh that required constant attention. To satisfy one claim, he transferred a parcel, obtained through Minnie. To soothe another, he pledged fixtures within the building, describing them as ordinary hotel appointments. A title examiner skimming new filings recognized a recurrent witness and began to keep copies in a private envelope, a habit born of curiosity that would later become useful evidence. What had felt like rumor now took on the texture of record. Receipts, ledgers, sworn statements, timed deliveries, the stubborn math of coal and acid, the names of women pinned to places that did not release them. The castle's architecture, engineered to fragment perception inside, had begun to fragment attention outside, scattering clues across trades and offices. But the scattered pieces were growing heavier, less ignorable, more numerous. The city, which had taught itself to look toward the lake, where light glittered, was beginning slowly, reluctantly to glance south, toward a brick building whose corridors led not to comfort but to concealment. The machinery continued to turn, quiet and exacting, while what lay beyond its walls edged closer to calling the pattern by its name. If the shadow of Holmes's castle has already unsettled you, then brace yourself. The darkest revelations still wait ahead. Take a moment now to share this story with someone who believes evil only exists in fiction, and let them see how deeply it has walked in our history. Subscribe so you never miss the chilling truths hidden behind America's most celebrated events. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from, because the past has a way of reaching into every corner, and sometimes the horror feels closer than we dare admit. By the autumn of 1894, the castle at 63rd and Wallace stood at the edge of exposure. For more than a year, rumors had thickened around it, yet they remained only whispers scattered among shopkeepers, clerks, and families waiting for daughters who never returned. But financial pressure was closing in on Holmes with greater certainty than suspicion ever had. He owed money to suppliers, investors, and associates who had grown weary of promises. Fraudulent schemes outside Chicago had collapsed, and creditors began to look more closely at the properties he controlled. The castle, once his shield, now became the focus of unwanted attention. When investigators and officers finally entered the building with authority, they were confronted with a geography that defied expectation. Doors opened onto blank walls, staircases climbed into ceilings, narrow passages ended in locked iron plates. It was a labyrinth designed not for confusion alone, but for control. The first impression was one of architectural madness, a hotel built without reason. Yet the pattern revealed itself in the details. Rooms sealed tight, walls lined with asbestos, and gas fixtures that could be turned from hidden valves in adjacent chambers. The investigators moved with lanterns through hallways that swallowed their light, their footsteps echoing against plaster that seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it. The most chilling discoveries came in the basement. Here the castle surrendered its true purpose. The furnace, large enough to consume more than refuse, bore the marks of constant use. Ash lay in heavy drifts across the brick floor, streaked with fragments that resisted fire metal clasps, buttons, and teeth too durable to be destroyed. Barrels stood against the wall, filled with corrosive chemicals capable of stripping flesh from bone. Tables, heavy and iron-framed, carried stains that no cleaning could erase. Surgical instruments lay in ordered rows, their precision hinting not at healing but dissection. The smell of scorched iron and chemicals clung to every corner, saturating the air until it became impossible to separate imagination from evidence. Among the items recovered were personal effects that spoke louder than any testimony. Jewelry engraved with initials, clothing trimmed in ways recognizable to relatives, letters half-burned but still legible with names and dates. These fragments, scattered through the basement, contradicted Holmes's habitual explanations that women had left voluntarily or moved west. Here were possessions no one would abandon willingly, objects meant to endure: rings, lockets, heirlooms. In drawers upstairs, investigators found correspondence addressed to women long missing. Offers of employment, promises of marriage, instructions for travel. Each letter was a lure, carefully worded to draw another victim across the castle's threshold. Reporters descended on the site almost immediately. What they found gave rise to headlines that spoke of murder factory and castle of horrors. Descriptions of the rooms filled the press. Chambers without windows, trapdoors that opened into darkness, hallways that led nowhere but into fear. Accounts circulated of a vault, steel-clad and airless, where scratches on the inside of the door suggested desperate attempts to escape. The city that had celebrated its triumph at the World's Fair now confronted the possibility that, in the same year, one of the greatest structures of death had operated within its boundaries. The horror grew as investigators connected names to the evidence. The Connors, Julia, and her daughter Pearl, once a familiar presence in Englewood, now presumed lost to the furnace below. Emmeline Sigrand, whose optimism had been recorded in letters to friends, silenced within a windowless chamber. Minnie and Anna Williams, last seen in Holmes's company, their property transferred into his hands, their fate sealed within the walls. Each case that had once been explained away as elopement or sudden departure now appeared linked by a single address. The castle's architecture itself became testimony. Gas jets connected by concealed pipes, could be operated from outside rooms. Wooden chutes angled precisely into the basement's core, too narrow for escape, too smooth for resistance. A sealed chamber lined with asbestos contained a vent that could admit gas but not air. Hidden staircases gave the proprietor freedom to move unseen between floors. It was not madness that shaped this place, but design. Every angle, every lock, every hidden corridor pointed to deliberate purpose, to lure, to confine, to erase. Neighbors who had ignored their unease now remembered sights and sounds they wished they had reported. Smoke rising thick at odd hours, the smell that clung to clothing, the faint thud of machinery beneath the ground. Delivery boys recalled crates labeled as medical supplies leaving the castle at night. Shopkeepers spoke of women who had asked for work and never returned. These recollections, once dismissed, now aligned into a pattern too grim to overlook. The climax of discovery was not only architectural but emotional. Families of the missing stood outside the castle, some clutching photographs, others holding letters. They waited for word, for confirmation, for any sign that their daughters and sisters had lived beyond its walls. Investigators burdened with fragments of jewelry and ash-stained cloth could offer only silence or a nod. The castle had consumed evidence as thoroughly as it had consumed lives. Its furnace had become the last witness, its walls the final record. Chicago, still basking in the legacy of the exposition, now faced the shadow of Englewood. The White City had stood as a symbol of progress, light, and modernity. The castle now stood as its opposite, a monument to secrecy, manipulation, and death. In the same year that the world celebrated invention, a man had constructed a building that redefined the architecture of horror. The break-in, the revelations of the basement, the inventories of belongings all formed a single moment when whispers became proof, and rumor hardened into history. The climax was the unveiling of what had long been hidden, a structure masquerading as hospitality, a proprietor masquerading as a doctor, a city masquerading as safe. The castle had been unmasked, and in the glow of lanterns and the ink of reporters' pens, the horror within Englewood stepped into public knowledge. What remained was the question of how such a place could have existed in plain sight, and how many lives had ended within its walls, while the world celebrated only blocks away. The revelations within the castle did not end with the furnace, the vats, or the sealed chambers. As investigators pressed deeper into Holmes's belongings, they uncovered documents that spoke with chilling clarity about the man's intent. In a safe beneath ledgers and fraudulent deeds lay a collection of letters from women who had once trusted him. They asked about rooms, about employment, about futures that never arrived. Some bore hopeful lines, "I look forward to meeting you soon." Others included inquiries about wages and lodging. None of the senders were ever heard from again. The handwriting, neat and innocent, stood in stark contrast to the silence that had followed. Equally damning were the insurance papers. Holmes had arranged policies not only on his own properties, but on employees, partners, and acquaintances. His name appeared as beneficiary in places no ordinary employer would be entitled to. The pattern suggested a man who viewed people less as companions or workers and more as investments, assets whose deaths might yield profit. When those same names matched women who had vanished from Englewood, the papers became more than fraud. They became evidence of premeditated exploitation woven into his entire business model. In trunks hidden within the castle's rooms, investigators found women's clothing, some fine, some plain, all carefully folded. Dresses bore alterations that suggested their wearers never returned to claim them. Jewelry appeared in small boxes, lockets inscribed with initials, rings engraved with dates of betrothal. These were not the belongings of transients who had simply moved on. They were relics of lives interrupted, personal treasures preserved not by their owners but by the man who had erased them. The most horrifying discovery came in the form of a ledger written in Holmes's hand. At first glance, it appeared to be a record of shipments, labeled with clinical terms such as specimens or articulated materials. Destinations included medical schools and universities, places that would not question the receipt of anatomical parts for study, but cross-referenced against missing persons. The ledger revealed its true nature. Each shipment coincided with a disappearance. Each entry marked the transformation of a human life into merchandise. The castle had not only consumed its victims, but had converted them into profit in the most literal sense, selling their remains under the guise of education. While these discoveries horrified Chicago, Holmes himself was no longer in the city. As investigators cataloged the castle's chambers, he moved eastward, weaving fresh cons in other states. He posed as a husband to multiple women, secured loans under false names, and attempted to continue the pattern of fraud that had sustained him. But the walls were closing in. Creditors pursued him. Investigators shared notes, and his carefully separated identities began to overlap. When he was arrested in Boston in 1894 for insurance fraud tied to the murder of a business associate, the castle's story followed him. What had begun as suspicion in Englewood became a nationwide sensation. Newspapers turned the revelations into daily front-page horrors. Illustrations depicted the castle as a labyrinth of torture, its walls crowded with hidden instruments of death. Though some reports exaggerated details, the truth was already terrible enough. The American public, captivated by both the grandeur of the World's Fair and the grotesque reality of Holmes's crimes, devoured every detail. The phrase "murder castle" entered common speech, a shorthand for the unimaginable hidden within the ordinary. Families from across the country traveled to Chicago in search of news. They brought photographs of missing daughters, nieces, and sisters, pressing them into the hands of detectives. Some identified belongings recovered from the castle, a locket here, a handkerchief there. Others left without answers, only more certain that the building had swallowed their loved ones. The castle had become not only a crime scene, but a mausoleum without graves, its walls a collective tomb for those whose names could not yet be tallied. Testimonies began to surface from former employees and associates who had ignored their doubts. A carpenter admitted he had built a chute that dropped into the basement but had believed it meant for laundry. A clerk confessed she had seen women arrive for interviews and never depart, but had convinced herself they had found work elsewhere. A neighbor recalled the peculiar smoke rising on nights when the fair's fireworks masked the glow. Each testimony, small on its own, formed a mosaic of complicity, a portrait of how easily ordinary people had turned away from unease. The true climax of horror lay not only in what had been done within the castle, but in the realization of how long it had gone unnoticed. The exposition had brought the world to Chicago, and yet, only a few miles from the illuminated palaces of progress, a building of death had operated in secrecy. While the Ferris wheel turned and orchestras played, women vanished into rooms with locks on the outside, their futures erased beneath the roar of the furnace. The juxtaposition was almost too much for the public to bear, and it ensured Holmes's crimes would never fade quietly into history. As Holmes awaited trial, the castle itself became a spectacle. Crowds gathered outside to see the place that had become infamous across the nation. Tourists asked to be shown the rooms, the chutes, the vault. For many, it was an attraction as morbid as any exhibit at the fair, proof that horror could be as compelling as wonder. The building, once designed as a trap, had become a monument to its own infamy, a structure whose very bricks testified to the consequences of unchecked ambition and deceit. By the time the last of the papers were catalogued and the furnaces examined, There was no doubt that the castle had been more than lodging. It had been an enterprise of death, a machine fueled by charm, deception, and the vulnerabilities of those drawn to a city of progress. The ledgers, the letters, the possessions, the ash all bore witness to the deliberate transformation of human life into material gain. This was not chance, not madness, but method. And in that method lay the true horror of H. Holmes's creation, a building that disguised itself as opportunity while serving as one of the most efficient engines of destruction the modern age had yet known. The aftermath of the castle's exposure spread across Chicago like a slow-moving storm, reshaping the way the city understood itself. When authorities began dismantling the myth Holmes had built around his identity, they uncovered a patchwork of fraud, theft, seduction, and disappearance that stretched across years and states. What had once seemed like isolated mysteries, letters unanswered, trunks unclaimed, daughters who failed to return home, were now gathered into a narrative too vast and too grim to be dismissed as coincidence. Holmes was extradited to Philadelphia after the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, a business associate who had been drawn into one of his insurance schemes. The death had first been explained as an accident, a tragic mishap with chemicals, but investigation proved otherwise. Pitezel had been deliberately killed so Holmes could collect on a policy. When authorities traced the children of the Pitezel family who had traveled with Holmes in the aftermath, they found that 3 of them had also perished under his care. It was this trail of deceit and murder that ensured Holmes could not simply vanish into a new identity, as he had done so many times before. The trial became a national sensation. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators eager to glimpse the man newspapers had branded America's first serial killer. His calm demeanor disturbed many who expected either madness or remorse. Instead, Holmes spoke with composure, often smiling as though the proceedings were a performance staged for his amusement. He admitted freely to frauds and cons, but deflected the charges of murder, weaving elaborate stories about his supposed innocence. His testimony convinced few, but it fascinated many. Some observers wrote that Holmes seemed less like a man on trial than an actor in the role of villain, aware that his every word would be recorded in newspapers across the country. Evidence from the castle played heavily in the public imagination, even when it was not central to the trial itself. Reporters described the basement furnaces, the acid vats, the sealed rooms, and the vault where scratches on the inner walls suggested desperate attempts to escape. Families of the missing searched through belongings recovered from the building, identifying lockets, rings, or garments as relics of their lost daughters. The absence of bodies meant many cases could never be proven in court, yet the castle's design was damning enough. Few believed it could have been constructed for any purpose other than what it revealed. As verdict approached, Holmes took to writing his own accounts, filling pages with confessions and retractions. In some, he claimed to be guilty of dozens of murders. In others, he insisted he was entirely innocent. He wrote, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." The contradictory nature of these statements only deepened the public's fascination. Was he confessing to seek notoriety or denying to protect a self-image? The lack of consistency meant that truth remained elusive, but the spectacle of his words became part of the legend. The jury convicted Holmes of murder in 1895. Sentenced to death, he faced execution with the same eerie composure that had marked his trial. Reports from the day of his hanging at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia described him as calm, his expression unshaken, even as the crowd of witnesses pressed forward to see the man who had turned a building into a trap. When the noose was tightened and the lever pulled, it was as though an entire chapter of horror had reached its punctuation mark. Yet the silence that followed was not closure. but unease. Back in Chicago, the castle itself became a point of morbid pilgrimage. Crowds gathered to see the brick building, demanding tours of the chambers, where women had vanished. Enterprising locals charged admission to glimpse the vault or peer into the basement where the furnace had burned. The castle became both crime scene and carnival attraction, its grim fame ensuring that it could never again serve as an ordinary structure. In 1895, only a year after Holmes's arrest, a fire of mysterious origin consumed much of the building. Some claimed it was set deliberately to erase its legacy. Others suspected neighbors who could no longer tolerate its presence. The flames gutted the upper stories, leaving only a skeletal shell of brick. Eventually, the remains were torn down, replaced by an ordinary structure that bore no outward trace of the horrors that had once occupied the lot. But memory could not be so easily destroyed. For the families of the vanished, the castle remained a wound that never healed. They carried photographs of daughters who had left for Chicago and never returned, hoping for evidence that never came. For them, the castle was not simply a building. It was the last address of their loved ones, the point where life had ended and silence had begun. Their grief was compounded by the absence of graves, by the inability to mark their mourning with headstones. The castle's furnace had erased more than bodies. It had stolen the rituals of closure. Chicago itself carried the stain of the castle into the new century. The White City of the Columbian Exposition had been celebrated as proof of progress, but the castle revealed the shadows progress concealed. It forced the public to confront the fact that modern architecture and invention could also be bent toward cruelty. The same ingenuity that built Ferris wheels and electric lighting had also built soundproof rooms and airtight vaults. The duality became a cautionary tale told in editorials and sermons, a reminder that human ambition contained both brilliance and horror. Law enforcement agencies, stung by their failure to detect Holmes sooner, began to reconsider their methods. The castle exposed how easily someone could exploit anonymity in a growing metropolis, how a city overflowing with strangers could swallow the missing without notice. It demonstrated the need for centralized record-keeping, for better coordination between jurisdictions, and for a recognition that evil did not always declare itself in obvious forms. In many ways, Holmes's case pushed American policing toward modern investigative techniques, though too late for those who had entered the castle's doors. The legend of Holmes grew as details spread through pulp magazines and crime literature. Writers exaggerated the number of victims, turning whispers into figures of the hundreds. The castle was depicted as a place filled with torture devices, secret chambers more elaborate than those investigators had actually found. Yet the embellishments did not erase the truth, they amplified it. Even stripped of exaggeration, the facts were horrific. A man had built a structure designed to lure and erase, and he had succeeded often enough to leave behind dozens of shattered families. For the city, the castle became both memory and warning. Tourists asked to be shown where it once stood. Locals passed the lot with uneasy glances, remembering smoke rising at night, the smell of chemicals, the steady turnover of women who never returned. In time, the neighborhood grew, businesses changed, and new buildings rose. But the story endured. The castle had been reduced to ash and rubble, yet in the public imagination it remained intact, its hallways still twisting, its doors still locking, its furnace still glowing. The consequences rippled outward. Holmes's trial and execution marked a turning point in how America spoke of crime. He was not portrayed as a bandit or outlaw, but as something colder, a murderer who hid behind the veneer of respectability, who used charm as effectively as he used locks and keys. The phrase, "America's first serial killer," became a way for the nation to grapple with the scope of his crimes, as though naming him a first could contain the horror by suggesting it was an origin rather than a symptom. In the years that followed, ghost stories collected around the castle's memory. Some claimed to hear cries from the lot or to see smoke rising on still nights. Others whispered that the ground itself remained cursed, that businesses opening there would fail. While folklore embellished what history had already made grotesque, the persistence of such tales revealed something deeper, that the castle had become less a building than a symbol, a reminder of how thin the veneer of progress could be. The resolution of Holmes's story, his trial, conviction, and execution offered the public an ending. Yet the consequences endured in every missing person's notice, every unanswered letter, every family left with absence instead of explanation. The castle's destruction erased its walls, but it did not erase its lessons. Behind the bright facade of a modern city, one man had demonstrated how secrecy, charm, and architecture could be weaponized against trust itself. The resolution of the case revealed not only the guilt of a single man, but the vulnerability of a society eager to look away until the evidence was undeniable. And so the castle lived on, not in brick or ash, but in memory, a structure built from silence and secrecy that the fire could never burn away. History remembers the gleaming palaces of the Columbian Exposition, the bright lights that seemed to announce America's triumph over fire and failure, but it also remembers the dark shadow that fell only a few miles away. The castle stood as a reminder that progress and horror can rise together, that the same city which dazzled the world with invention could also conceal rooms designed for silence and disappearance. The story of H. Holmes is not only the tale of one man's crimes, but a warning about what happens when charm, secrecy, and opportunity meet unchecked ambition. Behind polite smiles and respectable facades, entire lives were reduced to ash, belongings were folded into trunks, and names were crossed out in ledgers as though they had never lived at all. It is easy to believe that such horror belongs to another time, but the lesson of the castle is that evil thrives where vigilance fails. Every community, every city that celebrates its progress must also remember to look closely at what hides in the margins. If this journey through America's first murder castle left you unsettled, share it with someone who believes history is only triumph and invention. Subscribe so you never miss the hidden stories that remind us how fragile trust can be. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from, because the past is never as distant as it seems. The shadows of the castle linger not in its bricks, which fire consumed, but in the questions it leaves for us today. How well do we know the spaces we live in, and how easily might darkness build itself right beside the light?